So, Ellie, for context, you're not live, are you, Jessica?
I am now. Hello, y'all. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jessica Drake, and I am the Director of Marketing in the Forum here at the Leadership Institute. I was voluntold to be in this role today. We've had some life happenings on our team this week, and so I'm usually behind the scenes, but today I am in your homes and office spaces, and I'm happy to be with you. So we're glad to have you here today. I see there are 15 of you so far. Welcome. We have a live event Q&A chat over to the side. If you don't mind, go ahead and test that out. You should be able to see that we have instructions to a handout that Kathy's going to reference in just a little while. So if you will download that and then go ahead and type in the chat and let us know if this is your first webinar or if you've been with us before. I have my a chat over here, and so you don't realize all the distractions until you're on this end of this. So yeah, just my apologies in advance. We're going to use the live event Q&A chat to make this very interactive. So Kathy has questions that we'll ask you throughout. Go ahead when you see those and give us some answers to her questions, and then type any questions that you may have in there, and we'll try to get to all of them. If there's one or two that we don't get to, we will get those answers for you and send it to you. What else? I guess that's all the housekeeping. So today's webinar is going to be facilitated by our friend Kathy Alford at the Columbus Coaching Collaborative. She is one of our contract facilitators and a fabulous resource. So I'm going to turn it over to Kathy. Hey, Kathy.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone to this afternoon. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, curiosity. So I am a coach with the International Coach Federation, and I do facilitation and some other things. And I have to say that curiosity, I think, is a topic that we all can incorporate in a much more impactful and intentional way in our conversations. And the benefits of that, as you will see today, are really pretty impactful. So with that, I want to get started by just taking a look at the purpose and the goal of our training today. What would I like for you to walk away with is the question that I ask. And these 4 things, I think, summarize it well. I want to define for you exactly what I mean when I talk about curiosity in conversation. I'm not just talking about curiosity for the sake of curiosity. I'm talking about how do you use it in conversation? And what is the value of incorporating that, learning that skill, being intentional about it in conversation? There's a neuroscience piece involved. I'm going to share some of that with you today, and I hope that you'll see that every time we're in conversation and we use curiosity, there's a positive impact on how that affects not only you, but the other person with whom you are speaking. And then also, what are just some simple things you can do to apply curiosity? So that's our goal for today. And with that, I have invited a special friend to join us today for this conversation. I brought Curious George because we all know from our reading, I read these books to my grandchildren every time they come over. And so what we know about Curious George at the beginning of every single story, there's a certain statement that says, "This is George. George was a good little monkey and always very curious." So Curious George brought curiosity into every single adventure that he went on. And as a result, it often looks like Curious George got in trouble. But at the end of every story, what we learn about Curious George is that there was good that came out of it. There was some sort of positive effect that came out of it. He met new people, he learned new things. And so by being curious, George certainly teaches us a lot. In George's life was a man in a yellow hat, if you recall. And this man in the yellow hat was always taking George different places and trying to teach him things. And there is a common thing that he said. he would always say something like, George, please stay here and don't be too curious. Now, we could see George just sitting quietly, not being curious, and we have to stop and ask, what would his life have been like had he not used curiosity? He would have missed wonderful opportunities. He would have missed a lot of lessons to learn, and he would have missed meeting a lot of people. And so what I want to ask you is to think right now about your yellow hat experiences. We're going to give you an opportunity to enter into the chat area. And here are just some questions I've put to get you thinking in terms of your yellow hat experiences. What common voices keep you from being curious? When you want to ask a question, but you stop short of vocalizing it, or what memories keep you from being curious? For me, I think back to my sixth grade math class with Mr. Suber. I still see what he was wearing. I can still tell what he looks like. But because of some of the memories that I had in that class, that keeps me oftentimes sort of stuck and quiet in a certain area of my life. Also, what fear keeps you from being curious? Perhaps it's something you've never tried. Perhaps it's something you want to do. Perhaps it's a dream you've never vocalized to anybody. These are some questions I have for you. I'm going to ask you to take a moment and enter that into your chat. And while you are doing that, I am going to move on to the next slide just to give you a few moments to capture that. There are benefits to curiosity. When we think about conversation particularly, we'll talk about that, but here are other benefits that we look at. It helps us to survive. Curious people are happier. Curiosity boosts achievement. It can expand our empathy. It helps strengthen relationships, and it can improve healthcare. For the sake of our conversation today, I want to talk about curiosity with these two perspectives in mind. How do we have conversation so that curiosity expands our empathy and helps to strengthen our relationships? Now, I want to stop right here and just see, do we have anything that came in through our chat, Jessica?
We do. We have somebody who says fear keeps them from being curious, that they fear the unknown. And then somebody else says the question they have is, will I seem not so smart?
Yes, and that will come up. You'll see in a moment. I have an image we'll take a look at, and you'll see that those very things come up. So let's look at a few more benefits and dive into this just a little bit deeper. So learning, research says that if you increase your ability to learn, that you will retain information. And this happens when your curiosity is piqued, or when it's ignited, or when you are intentional. And this point, when you're curious, the limbic reward system of the brain actually illuminates. If you see the images of that, you can see where that curiosity has a clinical effect on your brain, and we'll look at some of that in just a moment. This is exactly why teachers try to spark curiosity in the classroom, because they know if they can illuminate that limbic part of the brain, then the student is more curious and they're more apt not only to learn, but to retain what they learn. So definitely curiosity is a form of teaching. Also, personal growth. The degree to which you are curious is correlated with your level of openness to personal growth opportunities. And this also enhances your ability to connect with others. You know, sometimes when I hear people say, oh, I don't want to go to that class, I don't need any of the soft skills, I just have my technical abilities, I know my skills, I'll just stay over here in this job, I don't need any of that leadership stuff, it's just hokey pokey. You know, when I hear that, what I say is, you know what? Curiosity would expand your knowledge. Curiosity about personal growth, curiosity about that particular class or this particular workshop or this particular assessment that would give you information about yourself is an extremely important way of opening up our perspectives and learning. When we are looking to take in new information, it expands everything, and personal growth is certainly not an exception. It helps us to squash stereotypes. Curiosity promotes our cognitive process, as I've mentioned before, and it will lead to a greater capacity for personal development. And then what this does is when we are developing ourselves, when we're expanding our perspectives, when we're getting more curious, it has to help squash stereotypes, because then we're taking in more information and we're learning more, and it keeps us from getting stuck in that place that is a small mindset. I might describe it as that. And think about curiosity in this context. When we're in the middle of a dispute or negotiation, sometimes it's hard to get to some sort of resolution, some sort of collaboration, some sort of mutual agreement without engaging in curiosity. And the reason is that we can become defensive. When we get defensive, which I'll show you in just a few moments, and we're unwilling to listen to the other person's point of view, then we are not exercising curiosity. And at that point, we have already clogged the cognitive process. If you will, think of a train track in your brain. You know, we get on certain tracks, these neurotransmitter paths that we've created. And when we are not curious and open to explore, then what we're doing is we're shutting that down. We're staying stuck over in one little area where we can't follow that train track anywhere else. It's going to take us to a new place of discovery, a new way of thinking. And so there's a big cognitive benefit to curiosity. So Brene Brown is one of my favorite authors and researchers, and she says this: curiosity is an act of vulnerability and courage. We need to be brave enough to want to know more. So I go back to the questions I asked a while ago, and for all of us, none of us are exempt. We were talking about this earlier before we went live. All of us have something that holds us back. A little bit of a voice in our head that says, oh, you better not say that, or oh, they'll think you're stupid if you say this, or oh, you've never done that before, this is new, you may fail. And what I want to say today is that if we are brave enough to step into this open space where we don't know, sometimes we don't know what we don't know. If we are willing to step into that space and be curious, that is an act of vulnerability. That's an act of putting yourself out there for learning. It's an act of saying, I value the potential that I have to learn and grow, and I will step into this opportunity and be curious. I'll ask that question that I'm afraid to ask because maybe no one else will ask it, and it will provide information that will be powerful for all of us. And so curiosity, in a basic nutshell, is an act of vulnerability and courage. Now, what are the barriers to curiosity? Let's look at these 4 barriers, and then we'll just sort of touch on some of these. Undervalued, underprioritized, unsafe, unfocused. I can find myself in every one of these. What about you? When you look at undervalued, have you ever worked for someone or been in a situation where you weren't seen as productive? Or perhaps you worked for someone that was a micromanager and controlled, and you didn't feel that you were appreciated for the contribution that you made. What about underprioritized? I look at this and I think, well, you know, I'm an introvert. When I'm in a meeting, I am not going to be the first one to speak out because I need to think about it before I actually put language to my thoughts. I may not ask that question because I'm processing internally, or maybe the meeting is moving so quickly that we're not intentionally giving time for everyone to be able to think for a moment. Maybe we don't pause and just say, hey, let's take, you know, a minute and everybody think about this, and then we'll go back around the table and see what it is. So under prioritizing, unsafe. I bet all of us have felt fear at some point, psychologically or otherwise, where we are afraid to try a new event. We're afraid to speak out when we may be the lone voice stating the obvious. Unfocused. We don't know how to put ideas into action. Again, thinking that maybe my ideas will never get taken up, or maybe I feel stupid because no one else is asking this question. So many different barriers to curiosity. And I hope today, by me just putting them out here for you in black and white, that you'll recognize where you are. What are some of your triggers? What holds you back, keeps you from being curious? You may have read Cy Wakeman. She's written Reality-Based Leadership and No Ego. Great author, great books. And I love how she frames this whole notion of our story, our narrative that we tell ourselves. And Cy tells us that we all do this. When there is an event or someone says something, we take in information, we start filtering it based on our preferences, based on our understanding, whether that's limited or not limited. And when we're thinking about it, we're processing, and then we attach some emotion to it. And we may decide at that point that, well, I feel misunderstood, I feel misrepresented, this makes me afraid, I'm sad, I'm mad. And usually that forms our narrative that we start telling ourselves. She calls it our story, that we just start looping in our brain about this person or this thing. And we really, without being intentionally angry or mad or rude or unkind, we can believe our own stories. And when she says this, we are not the most reliable narrators, especially when it comes to the stories we tell ourselves about the workplace. And I could add in here, or our colleagues. Often we let our ego dictate the story. It doubts, it suspects, and it gossips, and it leads the charge on arguing with reality. So what is the story, perhaps, that you have in your mind that today, if you were curious and you called it up and you named it, you know, what would that story sound like? And I'm going to give you a few questions in a moment to challenge our thinking on our stories. Brene Brown, a researcher I mentioned before, this is what she says about it. The brain says to us, give me a story. Tell me what is happening. When the brain develops a story, we are chemically rewarded. The brain rewards us for a story regardless of its accuracy. Here we're talking about the story, our made up story based on what we personally are thinking and feeling. Our story needs the least amount of ambiguity and uncertainty that we can give it. And really what's happening here when we create our story, a lot of what's happening in the brain is that our body is wired in such a way that it wants to protect us. That's the fight or flight syndrome. And when we hear something or we feel something that feels unsafe or scary, or we're misunderstood or we're misrepresented in some way, the first response is for our brain to say, I need to keep you safe. That feels dangerous to me. I don't know what they meant, so therefore I'm going to form an assumption about that because I need to self-protect in some way. And that, friends, is why it is so important that we get curious. It's not just that we want to practice curiosity in conversation with other people. We also want to practice curiosity for ourselves. We want to investigate these stories that we're telling ourselves and get curious about where is that coming from. So here's a very easy acronym to remember. It's called HUT. It's probably my favorite acronym. It's so easy to remember, and it's so true. It is a basic need for all of us to be heard, understood, and taken seriously. If you stop and you just think about your own personal experiences, what does it feel like when you're interrupted? What does it feel like when you're sharing something that is intimate, personal, meaningful for you? Or perhaps it's a moment where you're being vulnerable and you're doing something for the first time, but yet you're really not being heard. Or someone steps over you, or just doesn't give you the credit. Maybe they take credit for what you do. I don't know. I could sit here, for hours and name situations, but really at the heart of the issue is that we all are human. We all have a basic need to be heard, understood, and taken seriously. Now, Susan Scott is author of Fierce Conversations, which is a fabulous book. If you don't have, I highly recommend. And she says the experience of being understood versus interpreted or heard is so compelling you can charge admission. The question I keep asking, I pay attention to, I listen and want to get better at myself is, how do I go from hearing to really, truly understanding someone? How do I move from what I'll mention in a moment, the 3 levels of listening? How do I move from a typical, fast-paced, level 1 listening to being curious and inquisitive and interested in that other person so that they leave my conversation with them feeling heard, understood, and taken seriously? So I have a healthcare background, and so that means you get to listen to me talk about the brain for a minute, because I love healthcare, and I am completely fascinated with this neuroscience approach to interaction with people. What happens in our brain when we are listening to connect? When I am curious and I am giving you an open space to be heard, understood, and taken seriously, things happen in our brain that help us to be more intuitive, to be more curious, to be more responsive. Things happen in our brain that helps us to step away from judging, forming a conclusion, evaluating, rejecting, making decisions based on our own limited amount of information. When we listen to connect, here are some other things that can happen in our brain. George Bernard Shaw said this: the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. The mistake that we all make when we think that we're talking with someone and therefore that is communicating. It is not. Or we're talking at someone, we're giving information, or we're telling that person, we're directing that person. And so therefore we think we have communicated with you. And may I just challenge you today to say, no, that isn't true communication. That just means we're using words to give messages. But we don't know that we've communicated unless we're using curiosity and we're using techniques that help us to check back in and make sure that we're both on the same wavelength, that we both have felt heard, understood, and taken seriously. So let's look at the brain. Let's look at what happens here. You know you have these neurotransmitters in your brain. If you look at this red section here, this is in the very back middle portion of your brain. It's called the limbic system, and this is the emotional seat of your brain. This is when something happens. This is that fight or flight place in your brain where you initially start to physically feel something that feels threatening to you. Maybe someone said something to you and that was hurtful. Maybe you became defensive in a conversation. Perhaps you're speaking to someone and they get defensive. And you're like, why did they get defensive about that? I would just simply ask a question. This amygdala area of our brain, the amygdala are 2 little almond-shaped parts of our brain that sit back there in that back next to the hippocampus, which is where we store our memories, which is interesting to me to think that the hurt, the pain, the reaction, the fight or flight that we have that is in the happens in the amygdala is right next to where we actually store memories. I wonder how many of those feelings that we end up storing and harboring and holding on to some sort of offense that may inhibit in some way us being curious and open with others. When we're in this state of fight or flight, our body is saying to us, I'm trying to protect you. I'm trying to take care of you. I am going to release these neurotransmitters. Cortisol is the main one I'm going to release. You're going to get that injection into your body. You're going to start to physically feel it because I'm trying to protect you. So when we're in conversations that feel threatening or I don't feel heard, maybe it's not the same as a car pulling out in front of you, but there still is this activity that happens in your brain and in your body. And what we want to do is we want to give a little bit of time, because science tells us that it takes about 10 seconds for your neocortex or your prefrontal cortex to get that information. It first goes back through the limbic system and then slowly transmits up to the prefrontal cortex, which is our logical, common sense thinking part of the brain. And so when we get to the prefrontal cortex, this is where we get oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin released. And we know that dopamine is that feel-good neurotransmitter that we like to get. We get dopamine when we eat carbs. And I could say a lot of other things that we do that releases dopamine into our system that is like a reward system. But what we know for sure is that if we respond and react, and we're down regulating with that amygdala, that causes distrust. That's where these stories are formed, or the confabulations, as Brene would say, the misrepresentation of what someone meant because we processed it through a story. That's where distrust happens. When we are open and curious, when we create that space to ask questions, to clarify, to paraphrase, to understand better, then what we're doing is we're given the best opportunity to build trust that we can. And so what's the moral of this right here? It is to say, recognize your triggers. And if nothing else, you ever wonder why they say count to 10? Because if it takes 10 seconds for that information to reach the logical part of your brain, then certainly we want to give it time to happen. And this isn't just about us in conversation with ourselves or what we're feeling. This also is about what is happening to someone else when you're in conversation with them. I look at this and I think, okay, goodness, when my children were teenagers, I wonder how my conversation with them was curious or not curious and was driven to release some of these neurotransmitters that may or may not have been helpful in our conversation. So when we are, excuse me, when we are processing from that limbic, that amygdala part of our brain, we close down, we hear voices, we shut down, we defend. Just imagine your wall goes up because your body is saying to you, hey, you better take care of yourself. And that inner voice is screaming at us to say, hey, you know what? You're in danger here. You're in danger here. And you will probably have some sort of physical reaction to that. This is when you have these high levels of cortisol released. So distrust or trust? Where are we with this? What does this look like for you? There's a 2014 study on brain activity in the journal Neuron. And it tells us that when you look at curiosity, the more curious a participant is about a given question, the more dopamine that person's brain will release upon learning the answer. And later, the researchers tested participants to see how well they had retained the information that they were curious about. And what they found was that dopamine enhanced connections at a cellular level. And even more surprising was not only did it enhance learning, even the information they weren't that interested in, they retained it as well when it was included with interesting information that they were curious about. So there's positive effects to our brain when we are being curious, when we're curious and releasing dopamine and some of those other enhancing neurotransmitters, then we are benefiting. When we're shifting out of that primitive brain into that prefrontal cortex. So here you have different mindsets. We're going to use the acronym reality. With the amygdala hijack, this is where we close down, we get small, if you will, we shut down. And perhaps people who work with us or for us may experience this as well when we're not communicating in a way that includes curiosity. So look, when this happens, look at this acronym here. We reveal less, we expect more. This is when we create higher expectations for other people. We may assume the worst. We're expecting something bad to happen, so we're looking with caution, interpreting with fear. But what happens if we're using our frontal cortex? What happens if we're releasing these positive neurotransmitters? We reveal more, we expect less, we create more of an open space for people to be wrong, to learn, to be vulnerable, to be able to learn from what they're at least trying to do, asking the questions. in a way that helps us all learn. We assume the best. So all of these are opportunities for us to be able to be intentional about what mindset do I want to take. And so I want to stop again. We're going to do a little chat here. I want you to think about your own personal amygdala reactions. Now, we all have them, so it's not like that anybody's on this call today who would not have an amygdala hijack in some way. Maybe we have identified it and we've learned how to control it, and we know how to breathe, we know how to take a walk, we know how to use language that helps to de-escalate. Well, I want to ask you right now just to think about yourself. Where do you feel the physical reaction of fight or flight? What happens to your body? Is it in your gut? Does your face flush? Does your heart start racing? Do your hands shake? Where do you physically feel that reaction? What do you do to relieve the immediate response? Do you know what your primary trigger is at work? If you're in your office working and two people leave to go to lunch and they didn't invite you, do you have a trigger reaction? If you don't get invited to a meeting that you think you should be invited to, do you have a trigger reaction? If your boss doesn't give you a performance appraisal that recognizes the value that you bring, is there some sort of trigger reaction for you? What can you do to become more self-aware of moving to your prefrontal cortex, of intentionally giving space for those positive neurotransmitters to be released? Because those bring value to us. Those help us. Those help us calm down the physical reactions. It helps us to think more logically. It helps us to be curious. So I have continued to talk a little bit here to give you an opportunity to answer. So Jessica, do we have any responses yet?
We do. We have just the feeling of being physically drained when there's an amygdala reaction. It's just, we can all relate to that. You're mentally you're done. We do have another question that is from Janicia. And it kind of goes back to what you were talking about, maybe the undervalued, the underprioritized. She asks, my boss doesn't see the value of employees in exploring their interests. How can I address that? Because I can't really control it.
You cannot control that. That's right. I think there's an opportunity to think about the certain words that we use and don't use. And I think also questions are good. So having curious questions, Janicia, I think for me, I would want to think of one or two questions I could ask to explore what my boss's interest is, what led my boss to the current position, what was he or she interested in as a child, how did he choose his career, some questions that maybe help shift the brain into the train track that helps my boss get curious about what that actually meant for him or her. Sometimes we have to get to the point where there's a common thread or a commonality, or where, in other words, when I use train track, I'll say it again. So we kind of all get on the same wavelength of what that really feels like and looks like. I've got a couple of questions coming up in a minute that may be helpful for you. But what I find in this situation most often is we can't tell somebody something enough that works our way out of that. That's why curiosity is so important. I wonder if you can tell me about a time when this, or I would love to hear about a time when you experienced this. That helps people to draw from their experiences rather than just what they have formed a belief system around. And when maybe that first question I asked about the memory, what memory do you have? And so it doesn't have to be a negative memory, it can be a positive memory. And the right kind of question helps to pull in a memory that helps you get on the same wavelength. So that's a good question. Thank you.
Awesome. And then we have one more kind of along that same train track. We talked about asking the right questions and knowing which questions to ask, but is there a right or wrong way to ask those curious questions?
Well, that's a good question. So I'll say, just simply speaking, the right way to ask the question is an open question, not a closed question. So asking a closed question sounds like, will you do this? Do you do this? Any question where the recipient could answer yes or no is a closed question. And for some reason, those seem to be easy questions for us to ask. And I think the reason they're easy is because we already have a predetermined answer of what we want to hear in our mind. And so we ask a closed question that is sometimes leading because that gets us closer to hearing what we want to hear. Most often people don't just come right out and say no. So they'll kind of dance around and may not say exactly what you want to hear. So that's the wrong kind of question. The right kind of curious question is always an open question, and it doesn't have judgment behind it. It doesn't have, you're not leading. You are simply asking a question to receive more information so that you can use that information in the most valuable way possible. And I want to say to you, we teach coach training, and I will say, coming up with the right question, the next best curious question is not always as easy as it sounds, because again, our train track gets clogged because it keeps saying, oh, you're not going to know the right question. Oh, you may ask the wrong question. Oh, what question should you ask? Therefore, we get distracted and pulled away from just simply being curious. And so to me, the best question is something that is in your mind that you wonder about. What is it that you wonder? Do you wonder, back to Janicia's question, Janicia, do you wonder what interest did your boss have when they were younger? What interest did they have that helped them to choose their career path? So the best question is the one that I think is begging to be asked, because there is this curiosity around, what was that like for you? How did you do that? So that's the short and skinny answer to that.
Great. Thank you for those.
You're welcome. Let's move on. So getting curious with myself. These are some things I would like to offer you to ask yourself when you get stuck in a story, when you get stuck in what Brene calls conspiracies and confabulations. How do you get out of that? What are some ways to challenge yourself? And these are some questions that Cy Wakeman gives us, and I think I've added one or two of my own. You can ask yourself, what are my assumptions? What do I assume about this person? What do I assume about my boss? What do I assume about my spouse or my child? And then I break it down into this. Is my assumptions based on facts? Are they generous? What do I know for sure? If I take my emotions out of it, what do I know for sure? What is a different perspective? And literally, there are times when I will have an assumption about something, and I'll visually see myself sitting in a chair, and then I visually see myself get up and go to another chair and sit down and look back at myself and ask that person, what are you thinking? What do you know for sure? If you put on a different hat, you sit in a different chair, and you look at this scenario from someone else's perspective, what would it look like? What might they be thinking and feeling? How could they see that? And so looking at it from a different perspective can be really powerful, but you have to be intentional enough to be able to look at it from a different perspective. And I would say also be vulnerable enough to say, if you're wrong, or if you've been narrow-minded, or if you've kind of shut down, you've allowed the chemistry in your brain to cause you to just shut down and limit because it feels frightful in some way to you. And then finally, what can you learn from being curious? The question I always ask myself is, what is the worst thing that can happen? If I don't ask this question, what is the worst thing that can happen? Yes, I'm being vulnerable. Yes, somebody may leave with a preconceived notion, but does that person's opinion really matter about me? I'll just continue to do what I can to be generous in my assumptions, ask good questions, and build trust. And instead of going to that distrust place, which is so easy to go to, remember, that's the natural reaction our body has. Our body's natural reaction is to self-protect. It wants to keep us safe anytime that things feel threatening. So here are some questions you can ask yourself to unpack that story. Now, I want to touch quickly on listening with curiosity, because we can't get curious unless we know how to listen. But there are 3 levels of listening. Level 1 really focuses on hearing without full attention to understanding. This could look like multitasking. This could look like, which many of us have gotten really good at multitasking, and some of us even say, hey, I'm really great at multitasking. And you may be, but if you are really great at multitasking, you are not great at listening. And so I want to challenge you to pull yourself out of what society has sort of pulled us into, with so much going on at one time, so many different ways of communication happening at once, to pull yourself out of that level 1, which says, go ahead and keep talking. I can check my email, or I'm on my phone. You keep talking. Level 1 just says, you really cannot hear everything that's going on. Level 2 focuses at a surface level, and it also focuses on 2 conversations that are going on. You have the conversation you're having with another person. There also is a conversation in your head. That conversation could be wondering about what you're talking about. It could be having questions. It could be forming an assumption. It could be reminding you that you've got another meeting in 5 minutes. But level 2 is we're listening. Maybe we put down our phone. Maybe we are asking questions. But we're not all in. We're not at what we would call a 360 listening level, active listening. To do that, you have to get to level 3. This focuses on all the energy that's around you. It means that you are paying attention to what you're hearing and also what you might be feeling that's going on in the room. We look at body language. We listen at tone of voice. We're feeling the emotion of what someone is saying, not just the words. And it's this kind of awareness, I think, that really opens the door for the best kind of curious questions. When you become a great listener, you need to be at a level 3. You need to intentionally be mindful. So how can you be mindful? Because we're sort of all in this habit of listening at a less than a level 3. So for me, I may have something written in front of me, maybe in my notebook that I carry to meetings. Maybe I've just got number 3 written at the top of my page. Or perhaps when I fold my hands in my lap, I put my non-dominant hand with the thumb on top. That feels awkward to me because I always do it the other way. That reminds me, hey, this may feel uncomfortable, but you want to be at a level 3. Or maybe I hold my pen in my non-dominant hand. These are just little techniques for me that make me aware that listening at a level 3 requires a little extra effort, and I need to be intentional about that. So we can hear, many of us do, we go all day long with this hearing in level 1, level 2. I want to challenge you today, if you're going to be a curious person, asking good, curious questions, making conversations matter, you want to listen at a level 3. Now, you have a handout here. I want to just briefly refer to your handout, because when we're talking with other people, we can come at it from 2 different ways. And I'll be the first to say that certain personalities may drift or have a preference for how that they are with other people. If you're Myers-Briggs and you're a feeler, you're going to be much more apt to have that softer feeling, empathetic conversation. If you're a thinker and a judger, you're going to be more apt to just cut to the chase, to get to the facts, to look at it from a black and white perspective, and may feel disconfirming. And so let's look at this. When you look at your sheet here, you'll see when we are speaking in a confirming way, we really are being inquisitive. We're asking questions that, again, open it up. They're probing, open questions. We are paraphrasing, so we make sure that we understand what the other person is saying. We're just giving it back to them in some way to clarify that you've understood and that they understand you. Because when you leave, you want to make sure that you both are walking away with the same thing. There's nothing wrong with asking, hey, what are you taking away from this? What did you hear? I just want to make sure that I heard the same thing you did. Affirming nonverbal behaviors such as having good eye contact, leaning forward, nodding the head, giving full attention. And again, I want to say, to be curious doesn't mean that you have to agree with someone. It means that you're just asking the questions so that they feel heard, understood, and taken seriously. You may have a completely different point of view and you will respond appropriately, but you don't have the beauty of that exchange without being curious. When we look at disconfirming, these are the things that shut us down: dismissing concerns, walking away from the interaction, saying things that are hurtful or inconsiderate, multitasking, interrupting, ridiculing, anything that I bet you if I were able to see all of your faces and ask you how it feels when you have this experience. How does it feel to you when someone does this to you? It doesn't feel good. And I would propose to you that it doesn't build trust. It doesn't do anything to enhance that relationship, to put down deeper roots of trust. And when we use the confirming style, by using curious questions and level 3 listening skills, there is so much good that can come out of it. There's so much learning. There's so much appreciation for each other and for our differences. Even though we may not agree, there really still is this beautiful place of appreciative inquiry that does help both people feel that exchange. Susan Scott says this: our work, our relationships, and our lives succeed or fail one conversation at a time. While no single conversation is guaranteed to transform a company, a relationship, or a life, any single conversation can. Speak and listen as if this is the most important conversation you will ever have with this person. It could be. Participate as if it matters, because it does. And you know, we're at a time right now with all of us where there is uncertainty. We're facing things we've never faced. It's easy for us all to be Monday morning quarterbacks, but we really don't know. So many of us don't know really what the future holds. And every conversation does matter. And so, you know, for me, I look at this and I go, what conversation are you putting off? What conversation is shut down? What conversation feels awkward? Well, what would you do? What is the one thing you could do to start opening up that conversation? Because in the long run, that may be the conversation that is most important to you at this moment. Now, Brian Glazer, you'll know him as the producer of the movie Splash and many other movies, very popular. And he's written a book called The Secret to a Bigger Life. And what Brian tells us is a successful life isn't about finding the answers. It's about asking the questions. So today, as I move us toward the end of the presentation, I want to offer you, I guess, a challenge to think about what questions you're asking. Is it just a question because you need details? Because just asking questions is not the right way to go about it. When we just ask questions, oftentimes what we're doing, people start to feel that we may be intruding in their life, we're being too personal. No, the curious question is the question that adds to the conversation. It makes the person feel heard, understood, and taken seriously. It is showing that you value them, that you care about them, and you care about what they think. So I want to make sure you don't hear me saying just start shooting questions off like a machine gun, because that's certainly not it. It's being intuitive. It's being intentional. It's really caring about what value is this other person bringing through conversation, and what question would I like to know more about? What do I want to know more about? How would I ask this question? So here are some examples for you. These are open-ended conversational questions. A good place to start are these two questions in orange up here. How does this or that compare to what you're ideally looking for? That's not a threatening question. It's not a judgmental question. It's just, if you will, peeling back the layers of an onion. I'm a visual person, so I think about that onion and I think, I want my questions to peel back the layers. I want to hear everything that person has to say or think about this topic. I may ask, how does this or that compare to your ideal situation? If this isn't working for you, what would work for you? Here are some other questions that are good open questions. When somebody shares something with you, one of my favorite things is I want to hear more, because likely they haven't told you everything. Maybe they haven't told you the motivation. Maybe they haven't shared why this is important to them. So thinking about these questions, which you're going to get a handout, so you'll have all these questions here. Just pressing in a little bit. Please say more about this. How will this impact you is a much better question than saying, how do you feel about that? You get a completely different answer if you ask someone, how will that impact you? Versus asking, how do you feel about that? What else should I know? I remember when I was in sales, when I left a call with a client, the last question I always ask was, what question should I have asked you today that I did not ask you? Because how could I know everything that person knows or what that person wants? And the only way for me to know was to ask the right questions. And if I had not asked the right question, I wanted to give that person an opportunity to tell me what else I need to know. So these are just some questions that can get you thinking in terms of non-judgmental, non-leading, open-ended questions. Jessica, I think I want to stop and just see if there are any questions about that particular slide.
Yeah, we do. We have a question here from Dreesy that says, how can you lead with curiosity without your team feeling that your questions are micromanaging? So coming from a good place, but not knowing how you're going to be perceived.
I think it is, it's the way the questions asked, Dreesy, and it's also, I think, the relationship. When we have a relationship with people where they believe the best about us, Brene Brown has a concept called living big. And the question that she asked in that is, can you say personally that you believe that people are doing the best that they can do? Now, I have to tell you, I'm an ISTJ on Myers-Briggs, and when I first heard that, I said, absolutely not. No, people are not doing the best that they could do. They could do better, because I'm like, thinking we can all do better. But after I sat with that a little while and I heard more of the heart of what she was saying, she really is saying, we don't know everything there is to know about everybody. We don't, I'm saying this, she didn't. We don't know what happened at their house last night. We don't know what they're going through right now with COVID-19. We don't know financially what's happening to them. If I get to the point where I believe you are doing the best you can do, and if that in some way bumps up against my boundaries or something that I have to put boundaries in place, then I will do it with integrity toward you and being generous in my assumptions about you. So I say that to say, I'm always asking, am I living big, based on her philosophy? And if I'm working with a team and my questions sound like they're micromanaging, they sound like they're controlling, you know what? I want to unpack that in some way. I want to do some assessments to learn about my team and for my team to learn about me, so we can move away from the judgments of I sound micromanaging because I just need more information, and I need you to give me that in written form rather than verbal form. Instead of leaving room for that to be misinterpreted, I want to be able to have an equal, honest exchange about what your preferences are and what my preferences are. And maybe that means that I have to preface my question with, for me, it would be, I'd have to preface it with, now remember, I have deliberative as a StrengthsFinder theme, and that means I'm really cautious. And so my question is coming from me needing to make sure that we're making the best decision, not because I doubt you or question you. So I think it has to do with building capital and trust, so that when we ask these questions, people know our heart, they know our motive, they know we're not second guessing them. And if we are micromanaging, well, that's a completely different topic. And I hope that anybody who would ask questions to micromanage would start to think about how what we've learned today about asking questions the right way, in a curious way, to get to what you have in your brain and your heart that will benefit all of us. So that was a long answer. Apologize for that, but hopefully.
That's not a problem. ESTJ over here. So I feel you on all that. Like, why would you wake up to be mediocre? But
Yes.
knowing that they are doing the best that they can
Yes.
sometimes help you, because if I'm going to waste energy and thought and time on having a conversation with somebody that I don't think is going to be in the right headspace, that I don't go into that difficult conversation with the right headspace for myself. So if I believe the best in the person, believe that, you know what, they are going to make sure that I'm heard, understood, and then I think that helps me. And it goes back to, you can't control anybody else. You can just control yourself. And so I think those are all great points that kind of connect this whole curiosity theme for us today.
Yeah, and I try to remember that, the analogy, I said I was visual, but an analogy I get is, if we're going to go to Atlanta, there are a lot of different ways to drive to Atlanta. Is there the fastest route? Yes. Is there the most scenic route? Yes. So can I say that this is the best route that I'm taking? Well, it depends on the goal. It depends on the objective I'm trying to reach. And so I think the clarification, this gets into another topic, but just the clarification, the defining of the goal, and going back to this question, what are you ideally looking for? What is the expectation? Are we flushing that out so that when we have to ask different questions, that we are appreciating that someone may get there a different way, and that's okay as long as they get there within the time frame and the parameters, the expectation that we've set. Okay, so I started with Curious George, and I want to bring Curious George back. The one thing that Curious George has is he has the man in the yellow hat. And not only does the man in the yellow hat try to keep George safe, and he tries to keep him from not being too curious, he doesn't mean that in a negative way. Really, the man in the yellow hat is a fabulous mentor. He has done a lot of great things for George. And so what can we learn from the fact that George, yes, though curious, may get into trouble? What we know is that he is not shy about trying new things, that there is something that fascinates him when he is curious about exploration and learning new things that he doesn't know. The unfamiliar does not scare George. This is how he has learned through life. And so I want to say to you, being curious, being vulnerable is important, because we learn through that. And not only do we have mentors that will allow us to be curious, I want to challenge each one of us today to be that mentor that encourages curiosity. Maybe we ask the question before we answer. Maybe our philosophy would become to ask before we tell. Maybe we value other people by saying, listen, I have a direction about how we could do this, but I really want to hear what you think. And then listening to hear, understand, and take seriously, to be that person who is a mentor. And then today we started with Curious George. We're going to end with Albert Einstein, who said, I have no special talents. I am just passionately curious. So today, that's my wish for you, that you will become passionately curious. Jessica, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for all of that insight and thinking. I can already feel my brain churning over, just some follow-up things and some things that I need to do to better help my team. So thank you for that. And thank you guys for joining us today. We will make these slides and the recording of this presentation available to you. If you want to put your email in the chat, we will be sure to get that over to you. It'll also be on our Facebook page. We have in the chat also some links to a post-event survey for this webinar, as well as a pre-event poll for our next webinar, which is going to be this Thursday at 11. Courtney Laughlin is going to be talking about interruption or introduction. It's all about your perspective. So kind of puts a different spin on things, right in line with our curiosity theme here. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or just want to shout out a hey to us, please do so. You can email us at leadershipinstitute@columbusState.edu. We are always here for you and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.